Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Is the United States going to allow Russia to be part of any revived Iran nuclear deal? Well, there are suggestions that it could, despite the massive international sanctions imposed on Moscow because of events right now in Ukraine. On the other hand, there are rumors that Washington is looking for a deal with Tehran, but without Russia, allowing the West to buy Iranian oil once again, which in turn would reduce its energy dependence on Moscow. Where does the truth lie? Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The revival of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal would bring the United States back into the agreement and Iran back into compliance with limits on its nuclear program. And apparently it could be settled as early as this week, according to a diplomat at the talks. It would also allow Iran to set up oil exports to Western countries, as the United States stops its imports of oil from Russia and the EU aims to reduce its energy dependency on Moscow. Energy from Iran is looking more attractive to the West. Will the West depend on Iran for energy? Well, let's kick off by saying, first of all, hello to Mohammad Marandi in Tehran. He's professor at Tehran University, an Iranian-American academic and political analyst. Then we go to Samuel M. Hickey, research analyst at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C. Then to Germany, Seyed Hossein Mousavian joins us, former spokesman for Iran in its nuclear negotiations and former head of the Foreign Relations Committee of Iran's National Security Council. Mr. Ambassador, good to have you with us. And in London, Darya Dolzikova, who's with the Royal United Services Institution, Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Programme. Thank you very much indeed. Samuel, I want to come to you since you are specializing in weaponry and ask you, how far do you think Iran has progressed in the 4 years since the treaty was dropped in terms of enriching uranium to weapons-grade potential? In other words, how much closer is it to being able to develop a bomb?
So the reality is that right now, with no constraints on Iran's nuclear program, the breakout time, which is the time it takes for Iran to enrich enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, it is not the amount of time it takes for Iran to get a nuclear bomb, but that time is now down to a couple of weeks. And that is compared to the 12 months breakout time that existed when President Donald Trump walked into the Oval Office. And that breakout time is shrinking by the day. I would like to clarify that, again, this is just the breakout time, and that the amount of time it would take for Iran to create a nuclear weapon by the quickest estimates is about 1 to 2 years. Now, what the restored JCPOA, if we do get there, does is it extends the breakout time to more than 6 months. For sure, it is not as good as the original agreement, but this is because the United States voluntarily abdicated on restrictions that essentially blocked Iran's research and development. And in the past 3 years, Iran has made advances that are irreversible. But again, having said this, the JCPOA would restore the most rigorous monitoring mechanism that exists on any nuclear program anywhere in the world.
Okay, so let's go to Seyed Hossein Mousavian. Mr. Ambassador, you were party to the original negotiations at the early part of this century. I guess you've an idea what's going on. Sounds like the world needs this treaty pretty quickly.
Yes, I do believe. I think what the deal agreed in 2015, from 2015, at least for 3 years, Iran was in full compliance, and Iran really kept the promise. It was the U.S. broke the promise. And at the moment, still Iran is ready to come back to full implementation of the JCPOA. I think the issue is with the sanctions imposed during President Trump. Although we hear at least 90-95% of the draft is finished, agreed, but I think there is 1 or 2 major issues left, like lifting the delisting Revolutionary Guard from FTO.
But what about Samuel's assessment about how the time, what he called the breakout time, in other words, being ready to start on the road to making a nuclear bomb, has shrunk dramatically in the course of those 4 years. Two questions there. Is that because Donald Trump pulled out of the agreement? And secondly, do you agree that that is where we are now?
I think it is clear that everyone understands, everyone is, agree with us that it was the United States, President Trump withdrew from the deal, violated it, broke the promise. And that's why even 1 year after President Trump withdrew from the deal, Iran was in full compliance. Iran even gave, I think, enough time to the United States to rethink. But it was the U.S. increasing sanctions, pressures, coercion against Iran. That's why Iran started gradually to depart from JCPOA. Although even today, I believe Iran is at least in compliance with 50% of the JCPOA, while the US and even Europe, they are at zero compliance.
Okay, Mohammad Marandi, how much does Iran need this economically and politically to realign itself with other countries in the Western world, if you like, and to help the people who've been suffering under the sanctions that have been imposed?
The Iranians are quite willing to strike a deal with the P4+1. But the problem is that the United States is an unreliable partner. When the deal was signed in 2015, the United States began violating the deal immediately under Obama. Behind closed doors, Obama was telling the Treasury to threaten banks and financial institutions, insurance companies, and shipping companies not to work with Iran, and that was a violation of the deal. I spoke to Italian bankers who'd come to Tehran who told me that they were basically being threatened with punishment. So the deal actually says that the United States not only should stop impeding the normalization of Iranian business, but they should...
I suppose my point, and I'm stopping you midstream if you like, because I want you to get to the point, if you don't mind, which is how much is Iran hurting at the moment? How much does it need this deal?
Yes, what I'm saying, the reason why I pointed that out was that Obama and then Trump, of course, and Biden, by pursuing Trump's policies, make the United States an unreliable partner. But despite that, the Iranians are willing to go back to the deal. But so far, we haven't seen any goodwill from the United States. The United States, during the past few months, during the negotiations, they've been dragging their feet all the way, and so have the Europeans. And they are and of course, since they are targeting women and children, citizens, and ordinary people in Iran through the sanctions, that is the objective, the Iranians obviously want the sanctions removed. But they have to be removed in a way in which the Europeans and the Americans cannot cheat Iran again, like they did in the past. So what the Americans want is they want these loopholes, and so do the Europeans, so that they can take the Iranians by the throat again in future. And the Iranians are saying, if we abide by our commitments, you have to abide by your commitments as well. Okay. So Iran needs a deal. Iran wants a deal, even though the global situation is changing, the price of oil is up.
Well, let's get into the global situation, if we may. I want to bring Darya in. There are four of you. I have to be a little bit brief. I do apologize for that, because what we're talking about here is whether a deal can be agreed that incorporates both the United States and Russia, obviously, Iran and those other countries involved, but two countries that are in direct confrontation at the moment, if you like, over events in Ukraine. And we've got this from Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. He said, we've received written guarantees. They're incorporated into the text of the agreement itself. The Americans are trying to say every day that we're hindering this agreement, but this is a lie. The agreement has not yet been finally approved in some capitals, and the Russian capital, Moscow, is not among these. In other words, he reckons the deal's there. They've got it in writing from the United States. But how are we going to be able to reconcile these two sides that are at loggerheads at the moment coming together over this? Is it because fuel, energy is so important to both?
Sure, I think that's a good question. And I think we saw those tensions play out quite clearly in the last few weeks, the tensions between Russia and the US, the rest of the international community, really. We saw those play out in the Iran negotiations in the last few weeks. As you'd mentioned, Russia had reportedly demanded that some guarantees be included in the agreement around Russian trade with Iran. Now, I mean, I'm not in the negotiating room. I don't know what those requests were, but at the end, it seems like that got squared away. They managed to come to some sort of agreement. By the sounds of it, Russia will be able to carry out the engagements that are written into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Well, I was going to ask you this. What are the things that Russia needs to do as part of the JCPOA? Why is it vital to have Russia in there? It has commitments, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah. So Russia has commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So one of those things is shipping out highly enriched uranium out of Iran. So that will be quite key, considering that Iran is now accumulating a fair bit of it outside of what is permitted under the agreement. So once we're returning back within the scope of the agreement, it will be important that we're able to ship, and by we, I mean the international community, the parties to the agreement are able to ship the highly enriched uranium out of the country. So Russia is responsible for that. Russia has a role to play in the modification of some of the facilities in Iran, as well as the provision of nuclear fuel to Iran. So there are provisions within the agreement that require Russian involvement. So by the sounds of it, that there have been carve-outs made to allow for that to happen.
Funny one, this, isn't it, Samuel? Because Russia doesn't want Iran to be able to get the bomb, but equally, Russia doesn't want Iranian oil on the market in competition with Russian energy sources. It doesn't want Iranian oil or gas on the market because that would be detrimental to the Russian economy.
Yeah, so I would say that Russia's strategy has not changed in the long term. So Moscow does not want Iran to get the bomb, nor does it want a conflict so close to home. And if the talks collapse, there is a serious risk of escalation that could spiral into a conflict. A U.S. military intervention in Russia's backyard would bring U.S. troops closer to Russia's borders, which is not ideal for them right now. And of course, Iran, potentially getting a nuclear weapon, although I would like to say that so far they have not made the decision to do so. But if they were to do so, that would be very destabilizing for Russia because it could lead to a domino effect with countries in the region also pursuing their own nuclear capabilities. But you were right that in the short term, Moscow's strategy has shifted because it does not want the U.S. to necessarily reap the benefits of a revived JCPOA, nor does it want Iranian oil and natural gas on the market at this moment. But still, it is in the United States, it is in Moscow's interest, it is in Tehran's interest for the nuclear deal to be revived, to put Iran's nuclear program back in the box, and for those sanctions to be lifted.
Seyed, you are in Germany. That country is known at the moment to be sort of slightly torn about its energy dependence on Russia. Could you see Germany, if this deal goes through again, coming to rely more on Iran for its energy resources than it does on Russia at the moment? In other words, could this be a lifeline for Germany?
It is not only Germany. I believe the Europe needs seriously diversification in the source of energy, whether it is from Iran or Emirates or Saudi Arabia or other countries. I think Germany especially, however, Europe is heavily dependent on Russian energy. That's why they are really looking for a way to go toward a type of diversification. Definitely, Iran could be a great source for Germany and Europe.
And how much would that benefit Iran itself in lifting it back up into becoming an economic heavyweight again?
I think this has been a long strategy from Iran, even after revolution, for decades, in order to export the gas through Turkey or other routes to Europe. This is not something new. However, because of sanctions, Europeans, they never followed the case seriously. I think they are now rethinking, because they now understand how important it is. Because Iran has the second source of gas. Iran is the fourth producer of oil. Totally, I mean, this is a heavyweight energy provider, could be a heavyweight energy provider for Europe.
Okay, Mohammad Marandi, you're in Tehran. You say it's not the deal itself, but the context of the deal that matters. Help us with that.
Well, I think as the world is changing, the United States and the Europeans are seeing themselves as less important as before. And by constantly antagonizing Iran, they're simply pushing Iran closer to their rivals. And the Russians, by the way, I should point out, have agreed with the Iranians, and they will sign the deal if the Americans and the Europeans agree. It's not the Russians that are impeding the deal. The Russians are ready to sign as we speak. So the Russians aren't trying to block Iranian oil or gas exports, but the United States and the Europeans have antagonized Iran for so many decades, supporting Saddam Hussein, supporting the Shah, imposing sanctions on the country, on ordinary citizens, and that has pushed Iran in a different direction. And as we see the rise of Asia, I think that with the rising demand for energy, especially natural gas, Iran will be swift to find ways to export their gas to the east rather than to the west. So if Western countries want Iranian gas, they have to make a move in the right direction. We have many grievances. And it's interesting, the United States and Europeans constantly talk about Iran's nuclear program as if it is a threat to the international community. Yet they're the side that's dragging their feet. And that exposes the fact that they're not really concerned about Iran pursuing a nuclear weapon, because they know if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, they would have had it many years ago. The point has been till now to keep Iran down. But now that the whole global order is falling apart and we're entering an era of multipolar chaos, I hope not chaos, but disorder, I think that they will regret their policies towards Iran.
Well, I wonder, Mohammed, what you'll make of this from the Israeli Foreign Minister, Yair Lapid.
And we will, of course, discuss the status of the nuclear talks in Vienna. It's no secret we have our differences on this, but it's a conversation between allies that have a common goal, which is to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear threshold country and to stop Iran's ability to spread terror and instability all around the world.
Those last few words do not sound like a rapprochement, do they?
No, they've surrounded Iran with military bases. They've carried out assassinations against senior Iranian military figures, government figures. They've imposed sanctions on ordinary people. And most importantly, they constantly say all options are on the table, which is a threat of war. And of course, the United States, their involvement with the Saudis in Yemen and elsewhere, the Iranians see a very different picture than the United States. So if the United States really wants rapprochement with Iran, they're going to have to change their tune.
Darya, I want to ask you about, well, we've already mentioned the United States, Russia, Iran, Germany, other European countries by extension. I want to ask you about other regional neighbors who may feel mighty relieved that this is going to happen again. Give us some names and what the attitude might be.
Yeah, so I think dealing with regional anxieties and regional concerns, I think will probably have to be next after whatever the resolution is on the JCPOA, whether a deal is returned to or not. I think there is some cautious optimism in the region that an agreement will be reached. There's a hope that an agreement will be reached, not necessarily because I think regional actors think that an agreement will necessarily pave the way for better relations with Iran, but because there are concerns of what happens if an agreement is not returned to. There are concerns around the potential for further escalation, further destabilization from Iran in the region, but also what the response might be from countries like the US, like Israel, if the Iranian nuclear program is not, if there's no caps on it.
You didn't name a country for the first 2 or 3 minutes, but then you came up with one that I was going to ask you about, and that is Israel. Then we'll move on to Saudi Arabia. But what about Tel Aviv, first of all?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are concerns there, like there are in other parts of the region around Iran's intentions when it comes to the nuclear program, and around the ability of the agreement to contain it and to contain it long term. I personally think that the agreement is a good first step, but I do think there are concerns around what caps and what limitations there will be on the program moving forward, and how to deal with other issues in the region. More importantly, I think that's probably a priority for regional actors, really more than the nuclear program sometimes even.
Okay, what about Saudi Arabia? Massive oil producer. Would it like to see Iran, an implacable enemy in many ways, if you like, one a Shia stronghold, one a Sunni stronghold? Would it like to see Iranian oil on the market, or is that the last thing it wants? Where does that country fit in?
Sure, I think there's probably concerns there around the economic implications, but what we've been hearing in particular is the concerns that regional actors, Saudi Arabia and others, but Saudi Arabia in particular, have around, like I mentioned already, Iranian activity in the region. So not necessarily the state of the nuclear program, although that's certainly a concern. I don't think anybody in the region wants to see a nuclear capable Iran. But questions are around what an Iran with US sanctions lifted might be able to do in the region, and what an Iran with an advanced nuclear capability might be willing to do in the region as well. So I think external actors, the US, Europe, really need to make sure that they reassure Saudi Arabia and others in the region that they will not withdraw their support and their involvement in the region after any agreement is reached or falls apart.
Seyed, Hossein, Mousavian, it looks like a deal will be reached unless events in the world as a whole escalate, and we're talking principally about between the United States and Russia. We think there will be a deal. Will the world be a safer place because of that?
Definitely, because I think not because of Iranian non-proliferation policy. Definitely, Iran has never been seeking for nuclear bomb. It's clear. However, the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, is the most comprehensive agreement during the history of non-proliferation. Since this is the best and the most comprehensive document on non-proliferation, I believe this is an asset, not only on the Iranian issue. We can use the principles of JCPOA to regionalize in order to have nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. When we are talking about Israelis are the only country with tens or not hundreds of nuclear bombs. That's why JCPOA would be a great asset.
Okay, quick one. We've got about 2 minutes left. Samuel, you first, and then to you, Mohammed. Your sentiments about the fact that America seems to be getting blamed for all of this so far, and whether in fact we are going to see a brighter future for that area of the world despite what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, so I'm certainly hopeful and a little bit optimistic that we can resume compliance with the nuclear deal just because it is in everybody's national security interest. However, I would like to push back on the idea that Russia was not holding up the talks. Russia did make demands for sanctions carve-outs in relation to Ukraine, and specifically, Russia sought written guarantees from the U.S. on its ability to expand and enhance its ties with Iran, but from military cooperation to economic ties, and then obviously to the role that Russia is supposed to play in implementing the nuclear deal. On the nuclear side, the United States had no problem issuing waivers so that Russia could work as part of its responsibilities under the JCPOA. But the impression was that Russia was attempting to hold the talks hostage to get Western concessions on Ukraine.
Okay, got it.
So that's the one issue I'd like to push back.
Got it. Mohammad Marandi, thank you very much indeed. I hate to end this program on a downward note, but what could possibly go wrong?
Well, the problem is the United States, and it has always been the United States. They created this crisis in the first place. They've had an irrational hostility towards Iran since the beginning of the revolution, when people revolted against their Shah. The United States has to get over this. The problem right now, the Russians are not the problem. The Chinese are not the problem. Right? We are waiting for the United States to make a final decision. If the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, once said around the time of the negotiations of the JCPOA, that if the United States carries out its commitments in goodwill, then in future we could talk about other things. Obama wasted that opportunity. Trump, of course, we saw what he did. If the United States behaves in accordance with its obligations in the JCPOA, maybe in the future things could change.
Okay, well, that's extraordinary. Thank you. Probably the first time I've ever asked a professor to summarize something in 2 minutes, and you actually didn't overrun your time. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you very much, Samuel. Thank you, Seyed, and you, Darya, as well. Thank you for coming on the program. Thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. We're giving you the background, the context to events that are disturbing the whole of Europe, the Middle East, and by extension, the rest of the world. Do join us next time. Until then, from me, David Foster, goodbye.